Bright Tuty. Every student matters.
Hi everybody, welcome back to our class. So today we are going to look at chapter 12 of your history section of the book, and the title for this chapter is called Colonialism and Indian Towns. Town plans and municipal reports. So this chapter will be about colonial rule and the towns during the colonial rule in India, and we'll look at three specific cities, colonial cities, which are Bombay, Calcutta and Madras. Okay, and we'll also understand the planning of those cities, or in general what were the towns like, how did they develop during the colonial rule, what were the towns and cities like before the colonial rule, before the British established their control and power in India, and what were the changes that brought with the development of new towns, new cities, with the emergence of new cities, what were the impact, what were its effects on the society, on the people, etc. So this chapter is all about colonial rule and the towns and cities under the colonial rule or the British rule. Okay, now so we are going to look at the cities in India during the colonial period. There were many cities, okay? Like I mentioned when I was telling you about the topic, the title of the chapter. So three important and the biggest cities during the colonial rule were Bombay, Calcutta and Madras. There were others as well, but these three were the biggest ones. Okay. Now the cities which emerged during the colonial rule, they were not the first cities. Before that, there were no cities. That is not correct. Okay. Cities and towns have been existing since the ancient period. Okay, for this class or for this year, we are looking at the colonial rule and all the developments that took place in India during the colonial rule. And for this chapter, we are looking at the development of towns, development of urban spaces, development of cities. Okay, but that is not to understand that there were no cities before the colonial rule. Alright, cities and towns existed during the ancient period as well, and some of the important ones are Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, right? There are others as well from the Harappan civilization or the Indus Valley civilization, right? Like Kochi, Lothal, etc. Okay, Kalibangan. And these cities of the ancient period, they were well-planned cities. They were not just any cities that emerged overnight. They were well-planned cities. The people who lived during that time in those areas planned those cities, made sure how the houses should be, where the drains should exist, where the water or the dirt carried by the drain should end. All those were planned. Okay, and in these cities, there were local institutions to look after the well-being, the proper functioning of the cities. Local institutions like today we have municipality corporations, we have panchayats, we have committees, right? So all those are local institutes which make sure the proper functioning and running of the administration of the district, of the state, of the cities, of the towns or of the villages, right? So in a similar manner, such local institutions were also present there during the ancient period to make sure that the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro and other cities functioned properly. Okay. And when we come to medieval period, after ancient period, when we look at the medieval period, during that period also we find many cities, many towns. Some of them were very powerful, very popular. They were seat of power where the emperor lived, where the rulers lived, right? And these cities were mainly built by the Tughlaq and the Mughal emperors during the medieval period. So we know some of the important cities of that time: Delhi, Agra, right, etc. Lucknow, okay. Now, these emperors, the Mughal emperors, the Delhi sultans, they built magnificent cities. The cities were beautiful, the cities were powerful, the cities were of significance politically, economically. There were centers of trade and commerce. There were also centers of cultural activities, etc. Okay? And after that, we see similar emergence of important cities or emergence of new cities in a colonial period as well, if you come to modern period. So we saw how cities existed in ancient period, then medieval period, and then in modern period as well, when India was under the British government. Okay. Now, the development, the emergence of cities, towns that we see or we try to learn that existed or that came up under the British rule, that process is called process of urbanization. Okay, the process of urbanization, the process which saw the development, the expansion, and various functionings and activities in the urban spaces, in the towns, in the cities. So that entire process, how that was happening, why was that happening, who was behind the emergence of these cities, right? So all that process is what we are going to look at. Okay, so basically when we talk about the development of cities and towns during the colonial period, we are basically trying to understand the process of urbanization in the colonial period. Okay, now the cities and the process of urbanization, it had distinguishing features, it had distinct features, unique features, okay, which is why we are looking at the cities and towns of the colonial period, right? Every period had their unique development of cities and towns. Similarly, the emergence of towns, the development of cities during the colonial rule also had distinct features. The features which were unique, which were not as same as the development of cities during the medieval period, the development of cities during the ancient period. Okay, so that's why we look at the features of the development, growth of cities and towns in the colonial period. Okay. Now, as the towns and cities were emerging, as they were developing, as they were growing, it also brought some social changes. Okay, so urbanization, while we study the process of urbanization, we also have to study the social changes that urbanization is effecting, the social changes that is coming up along with the emergence and development of cities and towns. Okay, so the developments, the growth that we see in cities in the colonial period, we try to understand that by looking at the developments that happened, that occurred in three big cities of India during the same period, and those are Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay. Okay, so by looking at these three main cities which emerged as important, significant cities, colonial cities during the 18th and 19th century and also early 20th century, we'll try to understand the process of urbanization. Okay. Now, how do we study about the growth of cities, the growth and development of towns, right? So what are the sources for its study? Where do we get information about cities and towns? Okay, so let's now try to understand that. Now, the sources for studying and for developing an idea of the cities that were developed during the colonial period, the sources that we look at is colonial records, the records of the British government. Okay, that is the main source for studying, for understanding the development and growth of colonial cities and towns. Okay, so now we'll look at some of the records and we'll try to understand how it helps in our study of colonial cities. Okay. So the first that we are going to look at is the East India Company's records. So the East India Company basically means the British, right? Now, when the British consolidated its power and control over the territories in India, they carried out regular surveys. Okay, you know what surveys are, right? They go out and they go to different cities, different districts, different provinces, different villages, and they start gathering data. Okay, data about the number of people, number of houses, number of men, number of women, number of children, their occupation, their age, all these data basically meaning information. Okay, and these surveys were then published. Okay, they were published and they were published in journals, they were published in reports, government reports. Okay, so these also play important role in our study of urban spaces or cities or towns during the colonial rule. Now, while they surveyed, they also prepared maps of various cities. So they would go in person and then walk around collecting information and data, right? So as they did that, they also got an idea of the area of the place, right? So they would often draw maps, and those maps also are important. So these maps, these surveys are very useful for reconstructing the history of growth of the colonial cities. So they allow us to understand, okay, one area has this many population. That means the population may be not so large. But then if you look at a bigger city, say for example, if you look at Patna, if you look at Delhi, Delhi has larger number of people. So it's a bigger city, right? And then you see over time how the number of people living there is changing. It's increasing or decreasing, or people getting education is increasing or decreasing. People having different occupations are increasing or decreasing. So all that, and also the map. Okay, initially the map of the city may be small, occupying a small area, but then in the next 20 years, the area expanded. So that allows us to understand, just by looking at the maps and comparing them, we understand that the city was growing, expanding in area, right? So these records of the British government or the East India Company helps us to understand the growth of colonial cities. All right. Now next record that we can look at for the study of cities, colonial cities and towns, that is municipal records. Okay, this is the records kept by the municipalities. All right. From the 1870s, the British collected tax for administering towns through the municipality. Now, municipality boards or municipalities were set up in different provinces, okay? And these municipalities were responsible for collecting tax from the people. People had to pay taxes, right, for the upkeep of the towns. Say, for example, for cleaning the drain, for maintaining cleanliness, hygiene, for building roads, for making sure that the roads were big enough for carriages to run, and if there were travelers, if there were traders using those roads, the traders, merchants, the travelers had to pay a small amount of tax, road tax, right? So all those taxes were collected by the municipality for the upkeep of that place. The British government gave some responsibilities to the elected members of the municipalities. Now, these municipalities had responsibilities, okay, which were given to them by the British government. They had some duties that they had to do. So what they did, they provided essential services in the areas under their control. So what were the services? They supplied water, they maintained hygiene, they took care of the sewage, they built road, and they maintained public health and hygiene. Okay, so as they were providing these services, they maintained a record of all these activities. Okay, how much water was supplied, where it was supplied, what kind of roads were built, what were the networks, the road networks, whether it was reaching to other cities, other villages, and what was the condition of public health, whether there were many diseases, whether people suffered from many diseases, or whether people were sick most of the time, or whether the area was dirty. Okay, so all those records were maintained, were written down by the municipalities. Now these records also come very handy to us. Okay, they're very helpful to us to understand the problems of the growing cities. They help us understand the cities, its growth, its development, as well as the problems. What were the problems faced by the cities and towns during the colonial period as they were growing, as they were developing, as they were expanding. Okay. Now the third source that we are going to look at is the census reports. All India census reports. Okay. Now what are census reports? Census reports are reports that gives us information about the sex ratio. What is the sex ratio? The number of men and number of women living in a country, living in a district, living in a certain area, and their proportion, whether the men are larger in number than the women, or whether the women are larger in number than the men. Okay, so that information is also recorded by the census. The rural-urban population. Okay, the people living in rural areas, villages, countryside, and the people living in urban areas, cities, towns. The age of the people divided into different age groups: children, adults, elderly members, old people, right? Their occupation, their status. Okay, whether they are unemployed, whether they are peasants, whether they are farmers, whether they are merchants, traders, etc., and all the other status, whether how wealthy they are, or whether they are below the poverty line, etc. Okay, so all this information can be found in the census report. The census report provides these information. Okay, they collect information on the basis of these categories and they keep a record of it. Now this helps us to understand the people and the area and the social groups in the cities, in the towns. Okay, but this census report also helps the government. Why? Because by understanding the number of people living in the area, by understanding the strength of male and female, by understanding the age groups, by understanding the occupation of these people, and etc., the government makes plans for the development of the cities depending on the information provided by the census report. Okay, so that is why this also comes very handy for our understanding of colonial cities and towns. Okay, in 1872 the first census was taken. This was the year when the first census was taken. Okay, like the first collection of information on the basis of sex ratio, population, age group, occupation, status, etc. were collected. Okay, but this collection of report was only partial. It was not all over the country. It was not. It did not cover the entire territory of India. Okay. So it was only in 1881 that the first census of the entire country was taken, and that happened under Lord Ripon. Okay, and after 1881 the census report was taken after every 10 years, in every 10 years. Okay, so say for example the first all India census report was taken in 1881, the next was then collected in 1891 and the next in 1901. Okay, so in every 10 years, all right. Now, this census report is very invaluable to us for the study of urbanization in India, for the growth, emergence, development of urban areas, cities and towns in colonial India, as well as the changes that brought by the process of urbanization. Okay. Now, what we have to understand is that census reports give us lot of information. Okay, but we have to understand that the numbers, the information that we get from the census sometimes can be misleading, sometimes can be incorrect. They're not always correct. Okay, sometimes they are incorrect. Okay, sometimes they do not report the exact numbers. They do not report the exact situation on the ground of the people. Okay. Now, why can the information provided by the census sometimes be incorrect or misleading? Because the census, okay, when the information is collected, then, okay, divides the people into different categories. Say, for example, categories on the basis of age, right? Categories on the basis of occupation, categories on the basis of social status, categories on the basis of education, categories on the basis of caste, categories on the basis of all that, okay, religion, etc. Now, what this categorizing, of course, this categorizing gives us the information of people belonging to certain age groups, right? Between 0 to 10, between 10 to 15. So we get all that information. Occupation also, how many were laborers, how many unemployed, how many worked for the government, in the post office, in the administrative buildings, etc. We get all that information. But many times these categorizing and putting the people into these categories, these can be arbitrary or it can be random. Okay, random, and then and because it is so random, they just put without understanding the background of the people, without understanding that sometimes people have people can fall under a caste and occupation together, okay, because they are closely related. So now they have overlapping social status, they have overlapping occupation, okay, which overlap with each other, but their such overlapped social status is not taken into consideration by the British officers who are collecting the information. So they randomly put them in the category of occupation and then do not see other overlapping identities that they have. Okay, so then what happens? We do not get proper information. Okay, we do not get information about how some people may have overlapping identities. Some people may have their caste, okay, their caste categories as well as their occupation merged together, okay, and these are not properly taken into consideration by the British officials. So that gives us incorrect information. Okay, that does not give us the correct information or the overall information. That is why the information provided by census can be incorrect and misleading many times. Alright, that is why when we use sources, of course, sources such as census reports are very important for the study and understanding of urban colonial cities and towns, right? But when we use it, we have to use it with great caution. We have to be very careful, okay, while we use it, because we have to always remember that it can be misleading. We have to try to read between the lines, okay? So the census reports, the maps and the survey reports and the records of the municipalities, the records of the government, these are all, okay, despite the problems, despite the incorrect information which may occur or may not occur, these help us tremendously to understand the growth of the colonial cities, and to also see how the difference between the colonial cities and the pre-colonial cities. Okay, so if we have sources to understand the colonial cities, then we can see that how because of the information that we have, sources we have, we can better understand the colonial cities than the pre-colonial cities. Because before the British came and ruled India, these kind of records were not maintained. Of course, there were records, of course, they are available, there are sources, but not in an extensive manner as the British maintained. Okay, so we have better understanding of the growth of colonial cities than the growth of pre-colonial cities because of the sources such as census, such as surveys, etc. Okay. Now, let us look at the colonial rule and the Indian towns. Okay, we'll look at the Indian towns during the colonial rule. Now, when the British rule was established in India, the British government began to develop modern industries, and they began to also plan cities. Okay, so very soon cities like Calcutta, Bombay, Madras and Delhi were founded by the British government. Okay, now as they established these cities, okay, they also established municipal corporations, these local bodies, to run the administration of the cities, to make sure that the upkeep and the functioning of the city was maintained, well taken care of. Okay, now these municipalities and municipal corporations, they built roads, they checked and they built sewage systems, they built parks, public toilets, etc. Okay, they also developed the transport system for people to move from one place to another, as well as for goods to move from one place to another. They also made arrangements for supply of electricity, clean drinking water, hygiene, public health, etc. So all these were done by the municipalities, okay, in the colonial cities. Now, with the development of such bodies in the colonial cities and the emergence of colonial cities like Calcutta, Madras, Bombay, there was an increase in the population of the cities. The people living in the cities grew immensely. Okay. Now, how did the population grow? How? Okay. Because with the growth of the cities, many laborers from the surrounding villages or from other towns and cities, they migrated. Okay, migrated to this new emerging colonial cities for work, for better living standard, etc. Okay, now because there were so many people migrating to the newly emerged cities and towns, and because the population was rapidly increasing, there was a problem of housing. Okay, not everyone got houses. Okay, not everyone could afford houses. Okay, the cities became overcrowded, and as a result of the problem of housing, there was growth of slum areas. Okay, now as this problem started to take place, the British government did not take significant measures to improve the condition of the cities, okay, and also improve the condition of the poor laborers and workers who did not get any houses and who lived in the slum areas. Okay. Now in the beginning, the corporations, the municipal corporations and the committees which were formed by the government, they were under strict control of the government, of the British government. Alright. The members of these municipal corporations were nominated by the provincial governments meaning, so there were three important provinces in colonial India: Bombay, Calcutta and Madras. Now the province was looked after by the governor. Okay. Now these governors, provincial government, they nominated the members of the municipal corporations who looked after the administration of the colonial cities in the provinces. Okay. After the passing of the Local Self-Government Act in 1882 by Lord Ripon, majority of the members of the municipalities and corporations were elected. But after 1882, they were not nominated by the government, but they were elected by the government. Okay. During the colonial rule, the local bodies of the towns lacked financial resources and could not implement their plans for the improvement of the city life. So these local bodies, these municipal corporations, they did not get enough money which could be used for the proper administration of the colonial cities and towns. So because of that, they could not work towards planning for the improvement of the city as well as the lives of the people living in those cities. Okay. So those were some of the problems that we can see occurring in the cities and towns that came up during the colonial rule. Now let us look at some of the features of urban life in pre-colonial times. Before the British arrived in India, what was the urban life like? Okay, what shaped? How were the towns shaped? What were the features? Now the towns were centers of economic activities and cultures. Okay, there was trade and commerce taking place. There was buying and selling, also celebration of festivities. There were also temples and people coming to these temples for pilgrimage. So the towns are very important centers of activities, both economic and cultural. Okay. Now in the villages, people cultivated the land. They they worked in the lands, they grew crops, okay, they reared animals, and they also used the forest for collecting their food, okay. The towns were inhabited by artisans, okay. They were inhabited by traders, administrators, the nobility, and the rulers. Okay, the towns thrived, the towns existed because of the tax that was collected from the rural areas, okay, from the people living in the villages and in the countryside. Okay, the people living in the countryside and the villages, the farmers, the peasants, they had to pay tax, they had to pay land revenue, and that revenue was collected by the ruler, collected by the emperor, and that money was used for the development of the towns. So it was the revenue that was received, that was collected from, or that came from the villages, from the countryside, that allowed the towns to thrive. Okay. Now the towns were often fortified and surrounded by walls. The towns that existed, they were secured. Forts were built to protect them. Walls were built around the towns for protection. Okay, so this building of towns and forts, building of walls and forts around the towns, this symbolized separation of the town from the countryside. This clearly showed that the town was separated from the villages which lied or which were located outside of the town. Okay. But this did not mean, the separation did not mean complete stoppage of people moving in and out of the town. This did not mean that, okay? Because the villages traveling long distances on pilgrimages passed through the towns. Like I already said, that towns were centers of cultural as well as economic activities. So even if the people did not come to the town or pass through the town for trade and commerce, they came to the town and passed through the town on their way to the temples on pilgrimages. Okay. Now, sometimes the villagers also flocked to the towns in times of famines or droughts. So in cases of famines, in cases of natural disasters, the villagers often moved to the town to take refuge. Okay. Now, the people from the town also move out of the town to the villages for trading their goods. Okay, and when the towns were invaded, when the towns were attacked by the enemies, by other rulers, okay, the town people, the people living in the town, often escaped or ran out of the town into the villages seeking refuge and protection. Okay, so people living in the town also moved out of the town and went to the villages to trade, to sell the goods, and also to seek protection in times of attack by the enemy. Okay. Now, during the 16th and 17th centuries, the Mughal emperors built magnificent towns. Okay, so some of the examples are Delhi, Agra, and Lahore. Now, these were important centers of administration and power of the emperor. These were centers or these were areas where the government bodies lived, where they had their offices, where the courts were built, where the rulers or emperors lived. So these were centers of administration as well as the power. Okay. Now in the towns, the mansabdars, the nobility or the important officials of the emperor, like mansabdars, jagirdars, and other nobles, they built their houses in the towns and not outside of the towns. Okay. So some of the important towns from South India were Madurai and Kanchipuram. Okay. Now in these towns and cities in South India, large temples were built. And we know towns being centers of cultural activities, the people flocked to the towns in large number to come to visit the temples, to come for pilgrimages. Okay. So the towns developed as centers of trade and commerce as well as centers of cultural activities. So festivals, fairs linked with pilgrimages also occurred in the towns. Okay. Now the religious institutions like temples, all right, the temples which were often found or built in the towns and cities, they were patronized by the rulers. They were encouraged by the rulers. Money for building or constructing such religious institutions and temples, they were given by the rulers. Okay, so you see, the rulers played active part in the development of towns as centers of economic activities as well as cultural activities. Now, the medieval towns in North India, these towns in medieval India were under an officer called the Kotwal. Okay, so Kotwal was an officer. And what was his function? His function was to oversee the internal affairs and policing of the area. So basically, the Kotwal made sure that the area that the town was in order, there was no chaos, and also saw that there was no conflict, there was no invasion, there was no fight in the town. So basically, the Kotwal saw that the towns were properly administered for its better functioning. Okay. So this was how towns were before the British arrived in India, before the British established their control in India. Okay. Now after the British arrived to trade in India, things started to change in the towns and cities. Okay. So we'll look at the changes in urban life in the 18th century. Now, the most important change that we see in the 18th century is that old towns now began to lose their importance, their significance, and there were emergence of new towns which became important and which became significant. Okay. Now, how? Let's see. With the decline of the Mughal Empire, the capital cities like Delhi and Agra lost its importance, lost its political importance. Okay, and as a result of that, there was emergence of regional powers and regional cities out of Delhi and Agra, which were important for the Mughal emperors. So cities like Lucknow, Hyderabad, Srirangapatnam, Pune, Nagpur, Baroda and Tanjore, they became significant. Okay. Now, as the old cities lost its importance and new cities emerged with importance, who traded in the old cities, they now moved from the old cities to the new cities, okay, for job, for employment, etc. Okay, so the traders and merchants found employment as well as the artisans. Now, as a result of this, in these newly emerged cities, there were creation of new settlements called kasbas or ganj. Okay, this is where the people began to come and live. Now, during the 18th centuries, this was not the only change. During this time, European trading companies had arrived, and with them the commercial activities of these European trading companies led to the growth of the towns and cities. Okay. So from the mid-18th century, there was a change in the development of the urban areas. Okay, what happened? Important commercial centers like Surat, Masulipatam and Dhaka, these declined. These became no longer important. Okay, but in their place, instead of these, Madras, Calcutta and Bombay, they emerged as new commercial hubs, new commercial centers or capitals. Okay, and not only were they centers of commercial activities, but they also became activities of colonial power and administration. These were the places, these were the cities where the British government settled itself, where the British people settled itself and then built their offices, built their courts, built their palaces and buildings from where they ruled and they controlled the people in India. Okay. So the British, with their establishment in India, they built new buildings and institutions. Okay. Now, with the development of new buildings, institutions in new cities like Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, there was emergence of new occupations, new employments. So people from the surrounding areas, from the villages, from the countryside, from other towns, they flocked to these cities to grab these opportunities which the British government was creating. Okay, so by the end of the 18th century, the cities like Bombay, Calcutta, Madras had become the biggest cities in India. Okay, now let us see the development of these cities in the 19th century and after. Okay. Now, if we look at the census report, then the census report indicates, it shows that after 1800, urbanization in India declined. It was sluggish, okay? But it changed after 1853. Okay, why? Because railways were introduced. They were set up and they were introduced in India. Okay. Now, every railway station acted as a collection depot for raw materials from the surrounding areas, the hinterlands they were called, okay, from the hinterlands. Okay, raw materials were collected from the hinterlands and they were then distributed to areas from where they were taken to Europe. Okay, and then from Europe, the manufactured goods came and the railways collected them and distributed to different parts of India for its sale. Okay, so the railways played an important role in the development and in the growth of the cities and towns in India during the 19th century and after.